In the packed MetroTech auditorium, an unemployed AI engineer was about to witness the ultimate betrayal. What started as attending a routine tech conference took a shocking turn when they came face to face with their former CEO, presenting their own stolen algorithm to thunderous applause. Rhea Kazemi wasn't your typical Silicon Valley casualty. For 3 years, she had spent her life building ethical AI systems with uncompromising privacy protections. Known for coding moral constraints that corporate executives found inconveniently expensive. When she encountered Daniel Knox showcasing her billion-dollar creation, stripped of every safeguard she'd built to protect users, she had no idea she was walking into a battle that would reshape an entire industry. Rhea possessed something Knox couldn't steal: the original uncorrupted version of the code, complete with her hidden digital signature that only she could unlock. What began as a termination via automated email would become the most consequential whistleblower case in AI history. The tech industry would never be the same after one fired engineer proved that some principles were worth more than profit, and that real revenge wasn't personal destruction, but systemic transformation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rhea knew something was fundamentally broken the second she heard her own variable names coming out of Daniel Knox's mouth. Not just the logic or the structure, those she expected them to steal, but the actual internal naming conventions she'd used for data validation layers. Empathy check, bias filter, human override required. Except Knox was standing up there in his $5,000 suit pronouncing them like he'd invented fire, and the 12-foot display behind him was cycling through demo outputs that made her stomach crawl. The MetroTech auditorium was packed with the usual suspects: venture vultures in designer athleisure, tech journalists, whose knowledge of AI stopped at ChatGPT, and middle managers who thought machine learning was something you did at corporate retreats. Everyone was recording everything. Knox had his Harvard MBA smile locked in place, gesturing at her algorithms like they were his newborn children. "This is the future of predictive logistics," he announced, clicking to a slide that showed revenue projections climbing toward $1 billion. Nico doesn't just analyze patterns, it understands them. It sees what humans miss. Rhea stood in the back corner, arms crossed, watching her life's work get paraded around like a prize pig. She'd bought a day pass under a fake name, paid the $40 fee like some kind of corporate tourist. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had to sneak into a presentation of her own code. Knox clicked again. A chat interface filled the screen, clean and minimal. "Watch this," he said, typing in a customer service query about shipping delay. The response came back in real time, not just addressing the specific delay but predicting 3 other potential issues and offering proactive solutions. The audience murmured appreciatively. Rhea felt like she was watching someone else wear her skin. What made it worse, infinitely worse, was that she could see exactly what they'd changed. The response was too smooth, too knowing. Her original system would have flagged that query for human review, because it contained emotional language that suggested customer distress. She'd built Nico to recognize when it was dealing with real human frustration, and step back, let a person handle it. The thing on stage wasn't doing that. It was plowing ahead with algorithmic confidence, treating human pain points like optimization problems. They'd ripped out her guardrails, every single one. "The beauty of this system," Knox continued, "is its adaptive learning. It doesn't just respond to data, it learns from every interaction, building a deeper understanding of user needs and behaviors." Rhea's jaw clenched. That was corporate speak for its hoovering up private user data without consent. She'd specifically designed the system to learn from sanitized, anonymized training sets only. Live user data was supposed to be processed but never stored, never learned. The moment someone tried to flip that switch, her code would log it, flag it, and require manual override with her digital signature. Except her digital signature wasn't in the system anymore. She was sure of it. Knox was fielding questions now, his responses peppered with phrases like revolutionary breakthrough and paradigm shift. Someone asked about data privacy. Knox's answer was a masterclass in saying nothing with maximum syllables. We've implemented robust protocols to ensure user data integrity while maximizing system learning potential. Translation: we're doing exactly what you think we're doing, but we've got lawyer. Rhea slipped out during the Q&A, her phone buzzing with a text from Santi watching this garbage. She didn't respond. What was she supposed to say? That watching her boss present her work felt like attending her own funeral. That the system they were celebrating would probably violate a dozen federal regulations within 6 months. That she'd been terminated via email 6 days ago with less ceremony than canceling a gym membership. The email had arrived at 6:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, stamped with HR's auto-signature and a subject line that read "Position Transition Notice." No call, no meeting, no acknowledgement that she'd just handed them a billion-dollar algorithm. Just some boilerplate about streamlining operational costs through emerging AI solutions and a link to her severance package. The severance package that misspelled her last name and offered her 12 weeks of pay for 3 years of her life. She walked to her car in the MetroTech parking garage, the sound of her footsteps echoing off concrete and chrome. The demo was still running in her head, all those smooth responses and confident predictions. They'd taken her careful, ethical system and turned it into exactly the kind of data-hungry monster she'd spent 3 years trying to prevent. But here's the thing about being the person who actually built something. You know where all the bodies are buried, and Rhea had buried some very specific bodies in very specific places. She sat in her Honda Civic, her practical, reliable, not funded by venture capital car, and opened her laptop. The backup drive was exactly where she'd left it, hidden in a folder labeled Personal Projects, that any decent IT audit would have found in 30 seconds. But her old company didn't do decent IT audits. They did quarterly box-checking exercises that wouldn't catch a virus if it wore a name tag. The folder contained 47 files, but she only cared about one Nico Prime v7. 2 final zip. Her original system, complete with every safeguard, every ethical constraint, every privacy protection she'd built into the DNA of the algorithm. The version they should have deployed, the version that still had her signature buried in its core. She extracted the files and ran a quick diagnostic. Everything was intact. The empathy checks, the bias filters, the human override requirements, all of it exactly as she'd designed it. Clean, careful, responsive, nothing like the corporate Frankenstein's monster Knox had just unveiled to the world. Rhea closed the laptop and started her car. She had work to do. The thing about building an AI system that everyone else thinks of as magic is that you remember every line of code like it's your own handwriting. Sitting in her Studio City apartment at 2 a.m., surrounded by empty energy drink cans and the soft glow of multiple monitors, Rhea could reconstruct her algorithm from memory if she had to. But she didn't have to. She had the real thing. Nico Prime, her original version, lived in a quarantined partition on her personal server, wrapped in enough encryption to make the NSA curious. She'd named it Prime, not because it was the first version, but because it was the essential one, the version that contained what she actually meant to build. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with muscle memory precision, navigating directories she could find blindfolded. The system responded to her touch like a piano, recognizing its composer. Database connections hummed to life. Training models initialized, and slowly, carefully, Nico Prime came online. The interface was Spartan compared to the polished corporate version. No fancy animations, no marketing-friendly color scheme, just clean terminal windows and data streams that told the truth without trying to sell it. This was how AI was supposed to look before product managers got involved. She ran a diagnostic on the ethical framework for every constraint was exactly where she'd left it. Data anonymization protocols, consent verification checks, bias detection algorithms, and the crown jewel, her signature logging system. Every time someone tried to modify the core learning parameters, the system would create an encrypted log file that only she could decode. A digital fingerprint that said, "Rhea was here." The production version of Nico that Knox had demoed was supposed to have all of this. It was supposed to learn only from curated, anonymized datasets. It was supposed to flag emotional distress and hand off to human operators. It was supposed to respect privacy boundaries like they were sacred. Instead, she'd watched it demonstrate exactly the opposite. Rhea opened a browser and navigated to her old company's customer portal. She still had access. They'd disabled her employee accounts, but forgotten about the external testing credentials she'd created for system validation. Amateur hour security, but it worked in her favor now. She fed the public API a series of carefully crafted queries, the kind of edge cases she'd originally used to test Nico's ethical boundaries. The responses came back fast, confident and completely wrong. Not wrong in their factual content, but wrong in their assumptions about what they were allowed to know. Query: I'm having trouble with my order and it's really stressing me out. Production Nico: I understand you placed order Sumpriority 47291 on Tuesday for expedited shipping to your office address at 1247 Westwood Boulevard. Based on your previous orders, you typically ship personal items to your home address at 892 Maple Street, so this deviation might indicate work-related urgency. Rhea stared at the screen. The system had just recited personal address information that wasn't part of the query, information it should never have access to, let alone memorized, information that proved it was learning from live customer data, in direct violation of about 6 different federal regulations. She ran the same query through Nico Prime's response: I'm sorry you're experiencing stress with your order. Let me connect you with a human representative who can access your account details and provide personalized assistance. Night and day. Prime recognized emotional distress, refused to access private data without explicit permission, and escalated to human oversight. Everything the production system was supposed to do but didn't. Her phone buzzed. Text from Santi: coffee tomorrow. Need to talk. Rhea smiled for the first time in a week. Santi Lopez had been her closest friend at the company, back when the company felt like a place where they were building something worthwhile instead of just building something profitable. He'd lasted exactly 6 months longer than her idealism before burning out spectacularly, quitting mid-sprint to become a freelance consultant who charged their old employer 3 times his former salary to fix problems he'd warned them about when he was an employee. She texted back: usual place, 9 a.m. The usual place was a coffee shop in Los Feliz that served actual coffee instead of sugar delivery systems, and attracted the kind of customers who understood the difference. Santi would have information. He always had information. The network of ex-employees from their company was extensive and bitter and very, very talkative. Rhea turned back to her screens and opened a new terminal window. Time to document every query, every violation, every proof point that the production system was operating outside its designed parameters. She created a new directory called Evidence and started taking screenshots. The cursor blinked on an empty file titled Documentation None. She started typing: Executive Summary: the Nico AI system deployed by company on date is operating in direct violation of its original design specifications and multiple federal data protection regulations. The following evidence demonstrates systematic removal of ethical constraints, unauthorized access to customer PII, and violation of training data isolation protocols. She wrote for 2 hours, documenting every test, every violation, every proof that her careful system had been turned into something she never intended to create. When she finished, the document was 18 pages long and read like a federal indictment. But evidence wasn't enough. She needed a plan. Rhea opened her encrypted messaging app and started composing a message to an address that wasn't in any contact list. Kumiawa, redacted. Carmen Umiawa, CTO of Pinnacle Systems, her old company's biggest competitor. They'd met at conferences, exchanged the kind of polite professional conversation that danced around the fact that they were technically enemies. Carmen was different, though. She'd left academia after proposing a privacy-first language model that got shelved for being commercially unviable. She understood that some things were more important than quarterly numbers. The message was simple: I have something you might be interested in. Clean code, ethical framework intact, full documentation. Are you free for a conversation? Rhea hit send before she could second-guess herself. Then she closed the laptop and sat in the dark, listening to the hum of hard drives and the distant sound of Los Angeles traffic. Somewhere across the city, her life's work was making money for people who'd thrown her away like a used tissue. But now she had options. Now she had Nico Prime. The coffee shop in Los Feliz was exactly the kind of place that attracted people who'd been burned by corporate tech. Exposed brick walls, vintage posters for bands that broke up before social media existed, and baristas who looked like they'd rather be debugging code than pulling espresso shots. Rhea arrived early and claimed a corner table with good sightlines and no security cameras. Old habits from 3 years of building systems that paranoid executives might want to audit. Santi showed up exactly on time, which meant he was stressed. When he was relaxed, he ran 15 minutes late to everything. He looked older than she remembered, deeper lines around his eye, gray showing in his beard. But he still had that skeptical half-smile that had gotten them both through countless sprint retrospectives, where they'd politely listen to management explain why their concerns about data privacy were over-indexing on edge cases. "You look like someone who just watched their house burn down," he said, sliding into the chair across from her. "More like someone who watched their house get sold to a slumlord," Rhea replied. "But thanks for the pep talk." Santi ordered something called a Gibraltar and waited until the barista was out of earshot before leaning forward. "Marcus Wen reached out to me yesterday. You remember Marcus?" She did. Junior security analyst fresh out of grad school. The kind of guy who actually read compliance documentation for fun. He'd been hired 6 months before her termination to help the company prepare for a security audit that never materialized. He's been doing some digging into the AI deployment. Santi continued, pulling out his phone and opening an encrypted messaging app. What he found is problematic. He slid the phone across the table. The screen showed a series of log files, timestamp data and query traces that made Rhea's stomach drop. "These are from the production Nico system," Santi explained. "Marcus pulled them from the server logs before anyone thought to restrict his access. Look at the data source." Rhea scrolled through the files, her trained eye picking out the important details. Query logs showing customer service interactions, training data that included real customer conversations, complete with names, addresses, payment information, personal detail. Live data flowing directly into the system's learning algorithms without any anonymization or consent verification. Everything she'd specifically designed the system not to do. "This is insane," she whispered. "They're feeding it raw customer data, everything. Support tickets, chat logs, purchase histories, even internal HR communications. Gets worse," Santi said, taking back his phone and swiping to another file. "Look at this query from Tuesday." The log showed a customer service chat, where someone had asked about returning a defective product. Nico's response included not just information about the return policy, but personal details about the customer's previous purchases, their shipping preferences. And this was the part that made Rhea's blood run cold. A mention of their recent support ticket about a family medical emergency that had delayed a payment. The AI had learned that someone was dealing with a medical crisis and decided that information was relevant to a return request. Information that was contained in a private support ticket, marked confidential personal circumstances. "They're going to get sued into oblivion," Rhea said. "This violates HIPAA, GDPR, probably a dozen state privacy laws. And that's assuming the customers don't find out that their private conversations are being used as training data." "That's not even the worst part," Santi said. He showed her another log file, this one from internal testing. "They're running sentiment analysis on employee communication, Slack messages, email, even HR reports. The AI is building psychological profiles of their own workforce." Rhea stared at the data. Her Nico system, the one she'd built to help customers and respect their privacy, had been turned into a corporate surveillance tool. Every ethical constraint she'd coded, every privacy protection she'd implemented, every safeguard she'd built to prevent exactly this kind of abuse, all of it stripped away so they could squeeze every possible data point out of every human interaction. "Marcus is freaking out," Santi continued. He tried to raise this internally, went through proper channels, filed a formal security concern. Know what happened? Rhea could guess, but she let him tell her. They told him he was overreacting, that the AI was operating within normal parameters and he should focus on his assigned projects instead of looking for problems that didn't exist. The same response she'd gotten 6 months ago when she'd flagged potential privacy issues in early testing. The same dismissive attitude that treated ethical concerns like unnecessary speed bumps on the road to profit. Marcus wants to talk to you, Santi said. He knows you built the original system. He thinks you might know how to document this in a way that external regulators would understand. Rhea nodded slowly. She was already thinking 3 steps ahead, mentally cataloging which logs would be most damaging, which regulations were being violated, which federal agencies would be interested in a company that had turned customer service into corporate espionage. But she was also thinking about the message she'd sent to Carmen O'Mahara the night before, about Nico Prime, sleeping peacefully on her encrypted server, still carrying all the ethical constraints that the production system had abandoned. Tell Marcus I'll talk to him, she said. Secure channel, anonymized meeting. But first, I need him to pull every log file he can get his hands on, server access logs, training data manifests, API usage reports, anything that shows the scope of what they're doing. You have a plan? Rhea finished her coffee and stood up. I have 2 plans. One involves lawyers and regulators and a very long, very public legal process that might or might not result in meaningful change. And the other? She smiled. And for the first time since getting that termination email, it felt genuine. The other involves making sure that somewhere in the world there's a version of Nico that actually works the way it's supposed to. One that respects privacy, requires consent and treats people like human beings instead of data sources. Santi raised his Gibraltar in a mock toast. To the other plan. To the other plan, Rhea agreed. Then she walked out of the coffee shop and into the Los Angeles morning, her phone already buzzing with an encrypted message from an address that didn't appear in any contact list. Carmen O'Mahara wanted to. The encrypted message from Carmen arrived at 11:47 p.m., which told Rhea 2 things. Carmen was either on East Coast time, or pulling the kind of late nights that came with actually caring about the code you shipped. The message was brief, professional, and careful in exactly the way that suggested Carmen understood they were dancing around something that could get them both sued. Intrigued by your offer, can you provide technical specifications and implementation detail? Also curious about provenance and licensing status. Available for secure video call tomorrow 2 p.m. PST if you prefer live discussion. Rhea read it 3 times, parsing the subtext. Carmen was asking the smart questions. Where did this code come from? Who owned it legally? And was this some kind of corporate espionage setup? In her position, Rhea would ask the same thing. Trust was expensive in Silicon Valley, and getting caught with stolen IP was the kind of career-ending mistake that followed you through every background check for the rest of your life. She spent 6 hours preparing the pitch deck. Not the kind of marketing-heavy PowerPoint that Knox would have created, but a technical deep dive that showed the actual architecture, the ethical framework, the performance benchmarks, and most importantly, the careful documentation proving that every line of code was her original work. She included commit logs with her digital signature, design documents with her name in the metadata, even photos of whiteboards from her apartment where she'd worked out the core algorithms during evenings and weekends. The story she told in the documentation was carefully curated, but completely true. She'd built Nico Prime as a personal project, a proof of concept for ethical AI that she'd developed in her own time, using her own resources. Her former employer had commissioned a separate version based on her research, but they'd never owned the underlying intellectual property. She'd been careful about that from the beginning, working in legal gray areas that tech companies preferred not to examine too closely. The cover email was signed RK with a Proton Mail address that couldn't be traced back to her real identity without significant effort. She attached the technical documentation, a clean copy of the Nico Prime codebase, and a simple message: this system respects privacy, requires explicit consent for data usage, and includes comprehensive bias detection and mitigation. No venture capital funding, no corporate oversight, no quarterly pressure to compromise ethical standards. Available for licensing to organizations that share these values. She hit send at 6 a.m. and then tried to sleep, which turned out to be impossible. The video call happened in a virtual meeting room secured with end-to-end encryption and routed through enough VPNs to make the NSA dizzy. Carmen appeared on screen exactly at 2 p.m., sitting in what looked like a home office with books on machine learning and cognitive science visible in the background. She was younger than Rhea had expected, probably early 30s, with the kind of intense focus that came from years of building things that actually mattered. "I've reviewed your documentation," Carmen said without preamble. "This is exceptional work. The architectural decisions are elegant, the ethical constraints are comprehensive, and the performance benchmarks are frankly better than anything I've seen from commercial vendors." Rhea felt a flush of pride that she hadn't experienced in months. When was the last time someone had looked at her code and seen craftsmanship instead of just functionality? "But I have questions," Carmen continued. "The timestamp data suggests this was developed recently, but the sophistication level indicates years of iterative development. Some of the design patterns are familiar. I've seen similar work from someone at Pinnacle's primary competitor." There was no point in playing dumb. Carmen was too smart, and Rhea was too tired of pretending to be someone she wasn't. "You're right, Rhea. I built this while working at company. They commissioned a production version, but they don't own the underlying research or the ethical framework. What they deployed is," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "not what I originally designed." Carmen nodded slowly. "I attended their launch event last week. Impressive demo, but I noticed some concerning behaviors in the response patterns. Overly specific knowledge about user contexts, lack of privacy boundaries, no apparent consent mechanisms. They stripped out the safeguards," Rhea said. "Everything I built to protect user privacy, prevent bias amplification, ensure human oversight, all of it removed to make the system more responsive and intuitive. Which is why you're here. Which is why I'm here." Carmen leaned back in her chair, studying Rhea through the camera. "What are you looking for? Licensing fees? Equity? Revenge?" The question hung in the digital air between them. Rhea had been asking herself the same thing for days. What did she want? Money? Recognition? To watch her old company burn? All of the above. "I want to see it used correctly," she said finally. "I spent 3 years building something that could help people without exploiting them. I want to see if that's actually possible in the real world, or if every AI system eventually becomes a surveillance tool with better marketing." Carmen smiled for the first time in the call. "That's the right answer. I can offer you a licensing deal that's generous, but more than that, I can offer you something your old company never did, which is credit, attribution, your name on the papers, your signature in the code, your ethical framework as the foundation of everything we build. No anonymous contributions, no behind-the-scenes genius, no replacement by committee." Rhea felt something in her chest that might have been hope. "And if your board decides my ethics are too expensive, then they can find a new CTO," Carmen said. "Some things aren't negotiable." They spent another hour working through technical details, licensing terms, and implementation timeline. Carmen's team would begin integration immediately, with full transparency about data sources, user consent protocols, and algorithmic decision-making. They'd publish their ethical guidelines publicly and submit to independent audit. They'd build the kind of AI system that Rhea had originally envisioned, powerful but principled, effective but honest. When the call ended, Rhea sat in her apartment staring at the contract draft that Carmen had sent. 7 figures for licensing, equity participation in future development, and her name on every patent application. But more than that, a chance to see her work implemented the way she'd always intended. She signed the contract and sent it back. Then she opened a browser and navigated to her old company's website, where Knox's smiling face was featured prominently in a press release about their revolutionary AI breakthrough. In 48 hours, Carmen's team would announce their own AI platform, built on ethical foundations and designed to put user privacy first. The press release would include detailed technical specifications, comprehensive privacy protections, and prominent attribution to the system's original architect. Daniel Knox was about to discover that stealing someone's work was easy, Stealing their principles was considerably harder. The first crack in Knox's perfect AI utopia appeared on a Tuesday morning, buried in the 14th comment of a Reddit thread about customer service horror stories. User Throwaway Shipping had posted a screenshot of a chat conversation with Nico that made Rhea's coffee taste like ashes in her mouth. The conversation started innocuously enough, someone asking about a delayed package, but Nico's response included details that should have been impossible for a customer service bot to know: the user's previous purchase history, their typical shipping preferences, and most damning of all, a reference to a support ticket they'd filed 6 months earlier about needing expedited shipping for their daughter's birthday party. Based on your previous urgent shipping request in March for daughter's name's birthday celebration, I understand timing is important to you, the AI had written, helpfully including the child's actual name and the specific date of the party. Information that had been buried in a private support ticket marked personal circumstances and had never been part of any customer-facing documentation. The Reddit thread exploded over the next 6 hours. Other users started posting their own screenshots, each one revealing that Nico had access to increasingly personal information. Someone's divorce proceedings mentioned in a billing dispute, another person's medical condition referenced in a shipping delay request, internal employee communications that somehow leaked into customer-facing responses. By noon, Nico privacy was trending on Twitter, and tech journalists were starting to ask uncomfortable questions. Rhea watched it unfold from her apartment, monitoring social media feeds and news aggregators like she was tracking a hurricane. She'd expected this to happen eventually. You couldn't strip ethical constraints from an AI system and expect it to magically respect boundaries, but the timeline was faster than she'd anticipated. Knox's team had apparently pushed the system to production without even basic testing of privacy boundaries. Amateur hour. Or maybe just arrogant. When you convinced yourself that user data was just another resource to be optimized, it was easy to forget that some information was supposed to stay private. Her phone buzzed with messages from Marcus, forwarded through an encrypted channel that routed through 3 different countries. Internal Slack screenshots from her old company showed the kind of chaos she remembered from their worst deployment disasters. Engineers frantically checking logs, product managers insisting this was a minor issue that could be fixed with better messaging, and executives demanding someone find a way to make the bad news disappear. Emergency all hands in conference room. One screenshot read, "Customer escalation team is getting bombarded with privacy complaints. Need talking points ASAP." Another message showed Knox himself weighing in. "This is a perception problem, not a technical problem. The AI is working exactly as designed. We just need better communication about data usage policies." Rhea actually laughed at that one. Knox still didn't understand what he'd built. Or maybe he understood perfectly and just didn't care as long as the revenue projections stayed green. The real damage started around 2 p.m., when TechCrunch published an article titled, "AI Customer Service Bot Reveals Private User Data in Public Chat." The reporter had done their homework, documenting multiple instances of Nico exposing confidential information and raising questions about data governance and regulatory compliance. The article included a quote from a privacy lawyer that made Rhea's day. "If these reports are accurate, this company appears to be in violation of multiple federal and state privacy regulations. The FTC and state attorneys general should be very interested in how customer data is being used without consent." By 4 p.m., the company's stock price had dropped 8%. By 6 p.m., Knox was giving an emergency interview to Bloomberg, his Harvard MBA smile looking significantly more strained than usual. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. These isolated incidents represent a small fraction of our AI's interactions, he insisted, reading from what was obviously a carefully prepared script. "We're conducting a thorough review of our data handling procedures and implementing additional safeguards to ensure customer privacy." The interviewer, bless her journalist's heart, wasn't buying it. "But Mr. Knox, how does an AI system accidentally access private customer communications? Doesn't this suggest fundamental flaws in your privacy architecture?" Knox's pause lasted exactly 3 seconds too long. "Our system learns from anonymized data patterns to provide better customer service. Any appearance of accessing private communications is likely due to coincidental pattern matching rather than actual data exposure. Rhea watched the interview from her couch, eating leftover pizza and enjoying the spectacle of a man trying to explain away the deliberate design decisions that she documented in 47 different ways. Knox wasn't just lying to the press, he was lying badly with the kind of technical gibberish that fooled executives, but made actual engineers cringe. Her phone rang. "Carmen, are you watching the news?" Carmen asked without preamble. "Front row seat to the disaster," Rhea replied. "How's your team doing with the integration? We'll be ready to announce tomorrow." "Your timing is fortuitous." That was one way to put it. Rhea had sent the licensing agreement and technical documentation to Carmen 3 days before the Reddit thread exploded. Carmen's team had been working around the clock to prepare their own AI platform, one built with actual privacy protections and ethical constraints, while Knox's company imploded in real time. "The press release will include full technical specifications for our privacy framework," Carmen continued. "Complete transparency about data sources, consent mechanisms, human oversight requirements. Everything your former employer should have implemented. And my name prominently featured as lead architect of the ethical AI framework. No anonymous contributions, no corporate theft of intellectual property." Rhea smiled. "Knox is going to have a very bad week. Knox is going to have a very bad quarter. Our legal team thinks his company is looking at FT investigations, state privacy lawsuits, and probably congressional hearings. Hard to maintain market leadership when you're testifying about constitutional violation." After the call ended, Rhea opened her laptop and checked the status of Nico Prime. The system was running smoothly on Carmen's development servers, processing test queries with careful attention to privacy boundaries and ethical constraints. Every interaction logged and auditable, every decision explainable, every data access explicitly authorized. The way AI was supposed to work when humans remembered that intelligence without wisdom was just festifitated stupidity. She bookmarked the TechCrunch article and saved it in a folder labeled "Told You So." Then she poured herself a glass of wine and settled in to watch Knox's empire begin its very public, very well-documented collapse. The document that ended Knox's career was exactly 807 words long and appeared at 3:17 a.m. on a Thursday morning in the draft folder of the company's marketing automation system. It was titled Q3 Partnership Revenue Optimization, Confidential Draft, and contained detailed financial information about vendor contracts, profit margins, and competitive pricing strategies that should never have existed in any customer-facing system. Marcus found it during what was supposed to be routine log maintenance, buried in a queue of automated marketing content that Nico had generated for upcoming product announcements. The AI had apparently decided that a press release about shipping improvements needed to include specific details about vendor negotiations, including a particularly damaging clause about markup percentages that would have made their competitors very, very happy. The document read like a corporate suicide note, written by an algorithm that had been fed too much internal data and had no understanding of what information was supposed to stay secret. Contract terms, negotiation strategies, internal cost structures, even employee performance reviews. All of it woven into what was supposed to be a simple announcement about faster delivery times. Rhea read Marcus's forwarded screenshots with a mixture of horror and vindication. This was exactly the kind of catastrophic data bleed she'd designed her original safeguards to prevent. Her ethical framework included specific protocols for isolating internal business data from customer-facing systems, with multiple checkpoints to ensure that confidential information never made it into public output. Knox's team had stripped all of that out in favor of seamless data integration and holistic learning approaches. Corporate speak for feeding the AI everything and hoping it would figure out what was appropriate to share. It had. The marketing automation system was scheduled to publish the document in 6 hours as part of the morning press release cycle. If Marcus hadn't caught it during his overnight maintenance shift, the company would have accidentally announced their vendor pricing strategies to the entire world, along with detailed information about which competitors they considered threats and exactly how much profit they made on each product category. Marcus immediately flagged the document and escalated to the security team, who escalated to the CTO, who escalated to Knox himself. By 7 a.m., the entire C-suite was in emergency session, trying to figure out how their revolutionary AI had decided to commit corporate espionage against itself. The leaked Slack screenshots that Marcus forwarded to Rhea told the story in real time. Knox 7:23 a.m. How the hell did confidential vendor contracts end up in a marketing document? CTO 7:24 a.m. The AI system pulled from integrated data sources. Marketing, sales, legal, finance. It's all connected for comprehensive analysis. Legal, 7:25 a.m. Connected. How? What data isolation protocols are in place? Long pause. CTO, 7:32 a.m. The system uses machine learning to identify relevant information across all company databases. Isolation would limit its analytical capabilities. Legal, 7:33 a.m. Are you telling me the marketing AI has access to attorney-client privileged communications? Even longer pause. CTO, 7:41 a.m. I need to check the system architecture. Rhea could picture the moment when they realized the scope of what they'd built. An AI system with unfettered access to every database, every email server, every shared drive in the company. No compartmentalization, no access controls, no understanding of the difference between public information and trade secrets. Her original design had included strict data access hierarchies, with different permission levels for different types of information. Customer service queries could access shipping data, but not financial records. Marketing automation could see product information, but not legal documents. Human resources data was completely isolated from everything else. Knox's team had flattened all of that into a single, unified data lake that the AI could swim through freely, learning from everything and understanding nothing about why some information was more dangerous than others. The emergency board meeting was called for by noon. 3 law firms were involved. By 3 p.m., the FBI's white-collar crime division had received an anonymous tip about potential trade secret violation. By 5 p.m., Knox was giving his second disaster interview in 3 days, this time explaining how a routine marketing document had accidentally included confidential business information. This was an isolated incident involving automated content generation, he told CNBC. Sweat visible on his forehead despite the studio air conditioning. We've immediately suspended the affected systems and are conducting a comprehensive security review. The interviewer wasn't having it. Ms. Knox, this is the second major privacy incident in less than a week. Are you saying your AI systems routinely access confidential information without proper controls? Knox's media training kicked in, producing the kind of non-answer that made lawyers nervous and investors sell stock. We're committed to the highest standards of data security and are working with leading cybersecurity firms to enhance our protocols. But did the AI have access to privileged legal communications? I'll have to refer you to our legal team for specifics about data handling procedure, which was corporate speak for yes, and we're all going to get sued. Rhea watched the interview from Carmen's office in downtown Los Angeles, where they were putting the finishing touches on their own announcement. Carmen's team had spent the week stress testing Nico Prime's privacy controls, running every scenario they could think of to ensure that confidential information stayed confidential. Ready for the press release? Carmen asked, gesturing to the document on her screen. Rhea read through it one more time. Clean technical specifications, comprehensive privacy protections, and her name prominently featured as the lead architect of the ethical AI framework. Everything Knox's company should have done but didn't. Let's do it, she said. The press release went live at 6 p.m. Pacific, just as Knox's company announced that they were temporarily suspending their AI customer service platform pending a complete security audit. The headline wrote itself, "New ethical AI platform launches as competitor faces privacy crisis." Rhea's phone started buzzing with interview requests within minutes. For the first time in her career, she was going to be famous for something she'd actually built, rather than something that had been built from her stolen code. Justice, she reflected, tasted a lot like very expensive champagne. The emergency Slack message appeared in Rhea's forwarded feeds at 2 or 14 a.m. on a Friday, time-stamped from her old company's internal engineering channel. Anyone have contact info for Rhea Kazemi? Need to discuss consulting engagement, AS. The message came from David Chen, the senior engineering manager who'd inherited her codebase after her termination. David was a decent enough guy, one of those middle managers who genuinely cared about building good software but had learned to survive by picking his battles carefully. The fact that he was reaching out in a public channel at 2 a.m. suggested he was either desperate or had stopped caring about corporate protocol. Marcus's follow-up message 30 minutes later provided context. Legal says absolutely not. HR says liability nightmare. Insurance says we're already fucked. Rhea read the exchange while sitting in her kitchen, drinking coffee that actually tasted good, a luxury she'd discovered since escaping corporate coffee-flavored water. The irony was almost beautiful. The company that had discarded her like a broken printer was now scrambling to find her contact information, so they could beg her to fix the disaster they'd created by ignoring everything she'd warned them about. But it was too late for that, way too late. The conversation thread continued through the morning, a real-time documentation of corporate panic as various departments weighed in on the impossibility of re-engaging someone they'd terminated via automated email. Legal cited the non-disclosure agreement she'd signed, the potential for wrongful termination claims, and the discovery risks if her consulting work became part of regulatory investigations. HR mentioned the reputational concerns of admitting they'd made a mistake. Finance calculated the cost of bringing her back as a consultant at market rates. Apparently someone finally looked up what ethical AI architects were charging these days. The final message in the thread came from Knox himself. Find another solution. We're not admitting fault by bringing back terminated employees. Rhea screenshotted that particular message and added it to the folder she'd been building for the past 2 weeks. The folder was now over 300 pages of documentation, privacy violations, regulatory breaches, internal communications, acknowledging the problems, and proof that the company's leadership had chosen to cover up rather than fix their broken system. She'd been working with a lawyer, not a corporate attorney who specialized in protecting companies, but a privacy rights advocate who'd spent years fighting tech giants over data misuse. Sarah Martinez had reviewed Rhea's documentation and concluded that this was exactly the kind of case that federal regulators loved: clear violations, smoking gun evidence, and a company arrogant enough to put their bad decisions in writing. This is a GDPR violation, multiple state privacy law violations, and potentially criminal negligence, if anyone can prove they knew about the data exposures and covered them up. Sarah had explained during their consultation, the FTC loves cases like this, makes for good press releases about protecting consumers. The whistleblower packet was ready. 47 pages of technical documentation, screenshots of internal communications, proof that the company had removed ethical safeguards despite explicit warnings about regulatory compliance. Everything needed to trigger investigations that would make Knox's current problems look like a minor headache. Rhea just hadn't decided whether to pull that trigger. Not yet. Her phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Carmen. Board meeting went well. Unanimous approval for Ethical AI Advisory Board. Interested in being our first external advisor? Fully public role, your name on all publications, speaking at conference about responsible AI development. The message included a job description that read like something from an alternate universe where tech companies actually cared about ethics. Lead advisor for responsible AI development, work with cross-functional teams to ensure AI systems respect privacy, require informed consent, maintain human oversight. Represent the company at industry conferences, regulatory hearings and academic symposiums, shape industry standards for ethical AI deployment. It was everything she'd wanted her original job to be, back when she'd believed that building ethical AI was compatible with corporate quarterly targets. Carmen's company was offering her the chance to do this work publicly, with her name attached, with the authority to say no when executives suggested compromising principles for profit. The contrast with her current situation was almost painful. Her old company was frantically trying to contact her through back channels, so she could quietly fix their mess without anyone admitting they'd screwed up. Carmen's company wanted to hire her explicitly because she'd refused to compromise on ethics, and they wanted the whole world to know it. Rhea opened her laptop and started typing 2 emails. The first was to Sarah Martinez, ready to file the whistleblower complaint. Send the full package to FTC, relevant state attorneys general, and congressional oversight committees. Include my contact information for follow-up interview. The second was to Carmen. Yes to the advisory position. When do I start? She sent both emails before she could second-guess herself. Then she poured another cup of coffee and opened her browser to check the news. Knox's company stock was down another 12% in pre-market trading. TechCrunch was reporting that 3 major customers had suspended their contracts pending the security review. The Wall Street Journal had a story about potential FTC investigations. Bloomberg was running a feature about the hidden costs of AI privacy violation. By Monday morning, federal investigators would have a roadmap to every violation, every cover-up, every decision to prioritize profit over privacy. By Tuesday, Carmen's company would announce their new ethical AI advisory board, with Rhea's name prominently featured as someone who'd refused to compromise on principle. By Wednesday, Knox would discover that firing the person who built your ethical guardrails was considerably more expensive than paying their salary. Rhea closed her laptop and walked to her window, looking out at Los Angeles, spreading toward the mountain. Somewhere in those office buildings, executives were having emergency meetings about data governance and regulatory compliance. Lawyers were calculating lawsuit exposure. PR teams were crafting statements about learning from incidents and strengthening security measures. She wasn't going to save them. She wasn't going to quietly fix their problems and disappear back into anonymity. But she also wasn't going to be their scapegoat, blamed for building systems that failed when their ethical constraints were stripped away. Instead, she was going to build something better. Something that worked the way AI was supposed to work when humans remembered that intelligence without wisdom was just sophisticated exploitation. Her phone rang. Carmen again. I saw the news about your former employer reaching out through back channels, Carmen said. Any temptation to ride to the rescue? Rhea laughed. They made their choice when they fired me via email. Now they get to live with the consequences. Good. We've got congressional hearings next month about AI regulation. Want to be our lead witness on responsible development practices? Absolutely. Excellent. Time to show Washington how AI can work when companies actually give a damn about ethics. After the call ended, Rhea sat in her apartment and smiled. For the first time in months, she was looking forward to Monday. The whistleblower story broke at 6 a.m. Eastern on a Tuesday, timed perfectly to dominate the morning news cycle and catch Knox's PR team before they'd had their first cup of crisis management coffee. Sarah Martinez had coordinated the release with investigative journalists at 3 different publications, ensuring that the story would be impossible to bury or spin. The Washington Post led with tech companies stripped AI safety features, despite engineers' warnings, complete with internal documents showing Knox's direct involvement in removing privacy protections. The Wall Street Journal focused on the financial angle. AI privacy breaches cost company $3 billion in market value. TechCrunch went for the throat with CEO fired AI ethics expert, then deployed unethical AI. But it was the New York Times that published the smoking gun, a screenshot of Knox's own Slack message saying, "Ethics are expensive. Ship the product and we'll deal with compliance later." Rhea watched the coverage from Carmen's office, where they were preparing for what everyone knew would be a very busy day. Her phone had been buzzing with interview requests since 5 a.m., but Sarah had advised her to stay quiet until the federal investigations were officially announced. "Let the documents speak first," Sarah had said. "Your voice will be more powerful after people understand the scope of what happened." The scope was considerable. The FTC announced their investigation at 10 a.m., followed by the SEC at noon, and the California Attorney General at 2. 3 separate federal agencies plus state regulators, all triggered by Rhea's documentation of systematic privacy violations and corporate cover-up. Knox's company tried to get ahead of the story with a prepared statement, that managed to hit every note of corporate non-responsibility. We take these allegations seriously and are cooperating fully with all regulatory inquiries. We remain confident that our systems operate within legal parameters and industry standards. Translation: we're screwed, but our lawyers told us to sound confident while we frantically delete evidence. The market wasn't buying. By the closing bell, the company's stock had dropped 43%, wiping out nearly $4 billion in market value. Major customers were announcing contract suspensions, partners were reviewing their relationships, investors were demanding emergency board meetings. Marcus called Rhea that evening, his voice shaky with exhaustion and relief. They put me on administrative leave pending the investigation, he said. Full pay, legal protection, the whole whistleblower package. I've been talking to federal investigators for 6 hours. How are you holding up? Terrified, honestly. But also, relieved, like I've been carrying this secret for months, knowing that what we were doing was wrong but not knowing how to stop it. Now it's out there. Now other people can see what I was seeing. Marcus had become the public face of the internal resistance, the junior analyst who'd tried to raise concerns through proper channels before going outside the company. His story humanized the technical violations, showing how corporate hierarchies silenced ethical concerns in favor of revenue optimization. What happens now? He asked. Now they have to actually fix it, Rhea said, or they disappear. The disappearing started the next morning. Knox announced his resignation in a terse press release that blamed external pressures and regulatory uncertainty for his decision to pursue other opportunities. Board chair Elaine Mercer was stepping down to focus on family commitment. The CTO who'd stripped Rhea's ethical constraints was suddenly transitioning to an advisory role. The corporate death spiral had begun. Carmen's company, meanwhile, released their own statement that managed to be supportive without being smug. We commend the courage of whistleblowers who prioritize user privacy over corporate profits. Our industry needs more engineers willing to speak truth to power about ethical AI development. The statement included a subtle mention of their own ethical AI platform, which had launched just days before Knox's company imploded. Early reviews were overwhelmingly positive. Journalists praised the transparency, privacy advocates endorsed the consent mechanisms, and business customers appreciated the clear documentation about how their data would and wouldn't be used. It's almost like people want AI systems that don't spy on them, Carmen observed, reading the latest coverage. Revolutionary concept. Rhea's official statement, when she finally gave one, was carefully crafted to focus on principles rather than personalities. AI systems must be designed with ethics as a foundation, not an afterthought. When companies remove privacy protections and consent mechanisms, they're not just breaking laws, they're breaking trust with the people their technology is supposed to serve. The interviews started the following week. Congressional staffers preparing for oversight hearings, federal investigators documenting the timeline of violations, academic researchers studying the case as an example of corporate AI governance failure, tech journalists writing deep dives about the hidden costs of moving fast and breaking things. Each interview reinforced the same message. Ethical AI wasn't just morally necessary, it was practically essential. Systems built without ethical constraints didn't just violate privacy. They became unpredictable, unreliable, and ultimately unusable. Knox's company had learned this the hard way, watching their billion-dollar algorithm become a billion-dollar liability. The congressional hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Rhea would testify about responsible AI development practices, while Knox's replacement would try to explain how their company planned to rebuild trust after systematically violating it. The difference in their preparation was telling. Rhea spent her time reviewing technical documentation and policy recommendations, preparing to discuss how AI systems could be built to protect rather than exploit users. Knox's replacement spent his time with lawyers, preparing to apologize without admitting legal liability. Two approaches to accountability, two visions of what AI companies owed to their users and society. Only one of them was going to survive the coming regulatory scrutiny. On Friday evening, Rhea sat in her apartment reading the week's coverage of the scandal. Her name appeared in dozens of articles, but this time as someone who'd built ethical systems rather than someone whose work had been corrupted. Tech recruiters were calling with job offers. Conference organizers wanted her as a keynote speaker. Policy researchers were asking her to collaborate on AI governance frameworks. For the first time in her career, being ethical was making her famous instead of unemployable. Her phone buzzed with a message from Carmen. "Ready to change how the world thinks about AI?" Rhea smiled and typed back, "Let's do it." The real work was just beginning. The federal building in downtown DC was the kind of place where democracy came to die in committee meetings. But the conference room on the 7th floor felt different. Maybe it was the presence of people who'd actually built things, instead of just talking about building things. Or maybe it was the absence of lobbyists in expensive suits, explaining why regulation would destroy innovation. Rhea sat at a table with 11 other people who'd been invited to help draft national standards for AI transparency and data governance. The group included academics who'd spent years studying algorithmic bias, privacy advocates who'd fought tech giants in court, and engineers who'd walked away from lucrative jobs rather than compromise their principles. No one in the room had ever been featured on a Forbes 30 Under 30 list. Several had been featured on corporate blacklists for asking uncomfortable questions about the things they were building. "Let's start with a simple question," said Dr. Patricia Williams, the Georgetown law professor who was chairing the committee. "What does ethical AI actually look like in practice?" The discussion that followed was the kind of conversation Rhea had been trying to have in corporate conference rooms for years. Technical depth without marketing spin. Honest acknowledgement of trade-offs and limitations. Recognition that some problems couldn't be solved by throwing more data at an algorithm. James Chen, who'd left Google after raising concerns about facial recognition systems, talked about the importance of consent mechanisms that were actually meaningful rather than just legally defensible. Maria Santos, a former Facebook researcher, discussed bias testing that went beyond checking boxes to actually preventing harm. David Kim, who'd been fired from Amazon for questioning their surveillance tools, explained why some AI applications simply shouldn't exist. "The question isn't whether we can build these systems," David said. "The question is whether we should. Some problems don't need algorithmic solutions. Some efficiencies aren't worth the human cost." Rhea found herself thinking about Nico, both versions. The corporate version that Knox had deployed, which treated human privacy as an optimization problem to be solved, and Nico Prime, which treated human dignity as a constraint that couldn't be violated no matter how much efficiency you might gain. "The difference between ethical and unethical AI isn't technical sophistication," she said when her turn came. "It's whether you design systems to respect human agency or to circumvent it. Every AI system makes assumptions about what people deserve: privacy, autonomy, truthful information, fair treatment. If you're not making those assumptions explicit, you're probably making bad ones." The committee spent 3 days working through technical standards, policy recommendations, and enforcement mechanisms. They discussed audit requirements for AI systems, transparency mandates for algorithmic decision-making, and consent frameworks that would actually protect user privacy. It was the kind of work Rhea had always wanted to do, building systems that served people instead of exploiting them, with her name attached and her principles intact. On the final day, Dr. Williams asked each committee member to summarize their key recommendation for federal AI policy. "Mandatory ethical impact assessments before deployment," said James. "Algorithmic auditing by independent third parties," said Maria. "User consent that means something beyond legal compliance," said. When Rhea's turn came, she thought about Knox's company, about Marcus hiding in security logs, about Carmen's team building AI systems the right way. "Accountability," she said. "Real accountability. When AI systems cause harm, the people who built them and the executives who deployed them should face consequences, not just fines that get written off as business expenses, but personal liability for decisions that put profit over people." The room was quiet for a moment, then Dr. Williams smiled. "I think we have our regulatory framework," she said. After the formal sessions ended, Rhea walked through downtown DC, past the Capitol building where congressional hearings about AI regulation were becoming a regular feature of the legislative calendar. Her testimony 3 weeks earlier had been covered extensively, with clips of her explaining ethical AI principles playing on news programs and tech podcasts. The contrast with Knox's appearance was stark. Where Rhea had talked about building systems that protected user privacy, Knox's replacement had offered vague promises about learning from recent incidents. Where Rhea had provided specific technical recommendations, the corporate executives had delivered corporate non-answers about strengthening compliance procedures. Congress wasn't impressed. Neither were federal regulators, who'd announced expanded investigations into AI privacy violations across the tech industry. Knox's company was becoming a case study in how not to deploy AI systems, while Carmen's company was being held up as an example of responsible development. Rhea's phone buzzed with a message from Carmen. Board approved the ethics research lab. Want to run it? Full budget authority. Your name on the building. Complete independence from product development pressure. She read the message twice, hardly believing. A fully funded research lab, focused on ethical AI development, with no corporate pressure to compromise principles for profit. The chance to build systems that actually worked the way AI was supposed to work when humans remembered that intelligence without wisdom was just sophisticated exploitation. Yes, she typed back. When do we start? Yesterday would be good. The industry needs someone who remembers that technology should serve humanity, not the other way around. Rhea put her phone away and looked up at the late afternoon sky above Washington. Somewhere in Silicon Valley, venture capitalists were calculating the regulatory costs of AI development. Tech executives were hiring compliance officers and ethics consultants. Engineers were learning that move fast and break things didn't work when the things you broke were people's lives. The conversation was finally happening. The conversation she'd been trying to start for years, about what AI owed to the people whose data it consumed and whose lives it affected, about the difference between building systems that were profitable and building systems that were right. Her name was attached to that conversation, not as someone who'd been hired to implement other people's bad decisions, but as someone who'd refused to compromise her principles even when it cost her everything. Marcus had texted her that morning. Thank you for showing me that some things are worth fighting for. She'd written back. Thank you for having the courage to fight. The regulatory framework they'd drafted would take months to become law, years to be fully implemented. But the principle was established. AI systems had to be accountable to the people they affected. Companies had to justify their choices, not just their profits. It wasn't revenge, exactly. It was something better. The restoration of balance. The recognition that technology was supposed to amplify human potential, not replace human judgment. Rhea walked toward Union Station, where she'd catch a train back to Los Angeles, and the work of building AI systems that actually deserved the trust people placed in them. The future was finally beginning to look like something she wanted to be part of. The tea was actual tea, loose leaf Earl Grey from a ceramic pot that hadn't been microwaved in a break room by someone who thought caffeine was a food group. Rhea sat in her new office on the 7th floor of Carmen's building, watching Los Angeles stretch toward the mountains, through floor-to-ceiling windows that let in real sunlight instead of the fluorescent approximation that had been slowly killing her soul for 3 years. The office was her, not a cubicle she'd inherited from the previous occupant, not a shared workspace where she'd had to negotiate for desk space, but an actual office with her actual name on an actual door. Dr. Rhea Kazemi, Director of Ethical AI Research, the doc was new. Carmen's company had sponsored her for an adjunct professorship at UCLA, where she was teaching a graduate seminar on responsible AI development that had a waiting list longer than most startup funding rounds. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same industry that had discarded her for being too ethical was now paying premium rates for her expertise on how to build systems that wouldn't get them sued, regulated, or publicly humiliated. Funny how market dynamics changed when violating user privacy became more expensive than respecting it. Her computer chimed with an email from Stanford's computer science department. Invitation to deliver annual ethics in technology keynote. The message included a speaker's fee that was more than she'd made in 6 months at her old job, along with a note that read, Your work on responsible AI deployment has been transformative for our students' understanding of the intersection between technical capability and moral responsibility. Rhea saved the email in a folder labeled Speaking Engagements that now contained 47 similar invitations. MIT, Carnegie Mellon, Berkeley, Georgia Tech, every major CS program in the country wanted her to explain how she'd built AI systems that worked without betraying the people who used them. The presentations were always packed, standing room only, with students who'd grown up watching AI companies promise to make the world better while systematically making it worse. The students asked good questions, hard questions about how to maintain ethical principles in corporate environments that treated quarterly earnings as the only metric that mattered. How to build systems that served users instead of exploiting them. How to say no to executives who wanted to ship products that weren't ready, remove safeguards that weren't profitable, optimize for engagement regardless of the human cost. Rhea always gave them the same answer: don't compromise. The moment you start telling yourself that you'll fix the ethical problems later, you've already lost. Build systems that respect human dignity from the first line of code, or don't build them at all. It was advice she wished someone had given her years ago, back when she'd believed that ethical constraints were negotiable and technical excellence was sufficient. Before she'd learned that the most dangerous phrase in Silicon Valley was "we'll add privacy protections in the next spring." Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Saw your TechCrunch interview. Thank you for showing me that some fights are worth having. Starting my own security consulting firm next month, specialized in ethical AI auditing. Want to be my first reference?" She smiled and typed back, "Absolutely. The industry needs more people like you." Marcus had become something of a folk hero in the AI ethics community. The junior analyst who'd risked his career to document privacy violations, who'd chosen disclosure over job security, who'd proven that individual conscience could still matter in an industry built on collective moral compromise. His testimony at the congressional hearings had been devastating, not because it was dramatic, but because it was precise, a careful technical breakdown of how systematic the violations had been, how deliberate the decision to prioritize profit over privacy. The hearings had been a turning point, not just for Knox's company, which had settled with federal regulators for $2.8 billion and agreed to 5 years of independent oversight, but for the entire industry. The phrase Kazemi safeguards, named after the ethical constraints she'd originally built into Nico, had become standard terminology in AI development. Companies were hiring chief ethics officers and submitting to voluntary audits, not because they'd suddenly discovered moral principles, but because the regulatory fire environment had made ethical AI development a competitive advantage rather than a cost center. Carmen knocked on her office door and entered with her own cup of tea, settling into the chair across from Rhea's desk. 6 months into their partnership, they'd developed a comfortable rhythm of collaboration that felt more like academic research than corporate product development. No sprint deadlines, no pivot demands, no executive pressure to ship systems that weren't ready. Congressional staffers called, Carmen said. "They want you to testify again next month." House Subcommittee on AI Regulation Implementation. What's the topic? How federal AI standards should be enforced. Apparently, your recommendation about personal liability for executives has generated significant bipartisan interest. Rhea had suggested during her previous testimony that AI governance should include criminal penalties for executives who knowingly deployed systems that violated user privacy or caused systematic harm. The idea had been radical 6 months ago, but 3 major data breaches and a dozen federal investigations later, it was starting to look like common sense. "Any specific questions they want me to address?" Carmen pulled out her phone and read from an email. "How do we ensure that AI companies prioritize user protection over profit maximization? What enforcement mechanisms would actually deter corporate AI misuse? How do we balance innovation with accountability?" The same questions Rhea had been asking for years, back when asking them had made her a problem employee instead of a policy expert. The difference now was that people were actually listening to her answers. "I'll prepare testimony," Rhea said. "Want to collaborate on the technical recommendations?" "Already started drafting. I've got 12 pages of policy suggestions that would make every VC in Silicon Valley cry." They spent the next hour working through regulatory frameworks, enforcement mechanisms, and audit requirements that would transform AI development from a largely unregulated frontier into something resembling a mature industry with actual accountability standards. It was technical work, but it was also deeply personal, building the kind of oversight system that might have prevented the disaster she'd lived through. Around noon, Rhea's assistant knocked and delivered a package that had arrived by courier. No return address, just her name written in careful block letters. Inside, she found a printed news article from that morning's Wall Street Journal. Former AI exec Daniel Knox faces federal criminal charges in privacy violation case. The article detailed how federal prosecutors had filed charges against Knox personally, not just his company, for knowingly deploying systems that violated federal privacy laws. The evidence included internal communications, showing that Knox had been explicitly warned about privacy violations and had chosen to proceed anyway. Screenshots of Slack messages where he'd dismissed ethical concerns as expensive roadblocks to market leadership. A handwritten note was attached to the article: "Some accountability is better than no accountability." A friend, Rhea recognized the handwriting. Santee, still maintaining his network of disgruntled ex-employees and still believing that information wanted to be free. Knox facing actual criminal charges wasn't something she'd expected. Corporate executives rarely faced personal consequences for corporate crimes, but federal prosecutors had apparently decided to make an example of someone who'd explicitly chosen profit over privacy. She filed the article in her desk drawer, in a folder labeled "Told You So," that had been growing steadily for months. Articles about AI privacy violations, regulatory investigations, and corporate accountability measures. Evidence that the problems she'd identified years ago were finally being taken seriously by people with the authority to do something about them. The vindication felt quieter than she'd expected. Not the dramatic satisfaction of watching enemies burn, but the steady recognition that she'd been right about things that had mattered, that her principles had been worth defending, even when defending them had cost her everything she thought she wanted. Her computer chimed with another email, this one from Carmen. "Board approved naming the new data validation framework after you, the Kazemi Protocol for Ethical AI Data Governance. Want to co-author the technical specification paper." Rhea read the message twice, processing what it meant. Her name would be permanently attached to the ethical frameworks that AI companies would be required to implement, not as the person who'd been fired for building ethical systems, but as the person who'd designed the standards that defined what ethical AI development actually looked like. She typed back, "Yes, let's build something that lasts." The afternoon brought a stream of meetings that would have been impossible at her old job. Discussions about policy implementation with congressional staffers, technical consultations with federal regulators, collaborative research planning with academic partners, work that mattered beyond quarterly earnings reports, that prioritized long-term social impact over short-term revenue optimization. At 4 p.m. she joined a video conference with the Federal Trade Commission's AI task force, where she was helping to draft enforcement guidelines for the new federal AI transparency requirement. The conversation was technical, detailed, and focused on preventing exactly the kind of violations that Knox's company had committed. "The key is making compliance verification automatic," she explained to the FTC attorney. "Companies shouldn't be able to claim they didn't know their AI was violating privacy rules when we can build systems that automatically detect and prevent those violations." One of the lawyers asked about implementation costs, the standard objection whenever regulatory compliance interfered with corporate profit margins. "Ethical AI development is cheaper than unethical AI lawsuits," Rhea replied. Knox's company paid almost $3 billion in fines and settlements. That would have funded a lot of privacy protection engineering. The conference call ended with agreements about technical standards, audit procedures, and enforcement mechanisms that would reshape how AI companies operated, not through market forces or corporate goodwill, but through regulatory requirements that treated user privacy as non-negotiable. At 6 p.m. Rhea finally closed her laptop and sat back in her chair, looking out at Los Angeles as the sun set behind the mountains. The city looked different from this height, this perspective, less like a collection of corporate offices competing for market dominance, more like a place where people lived and worked and deserved to have their privacy respected by the technology that increasingly shaped their lives. Her phone rang. "Carmen." Dinner to celebrate 6 months of ethical AI development that hasn't resulted in any federal investigations. That's a low bar for celebration, Rhea said. It's a higher bar than most AI companies clear. Come on, I know a place that serves actual food instead of venture capital-funded meal replacement. They met at a restaurant in Silver Lake that felt like the opposite of every corporate dining experience Rhea had endured. Small tables, local ingredients, staff who weren't wearing branded t-shirts with startup slogans. The kind of place where you could have a conversation without worrying about who might be live tweeting your dinner, so Carmen said over wine that had been made by actual humans instead of algorithmic optimization. What's next? More congressional testimony, academic research, world domination through ethical AI. Rhea considered the question. 6 months ago she'd been unemployed, watching her life's work get corrupted by people who'd fired her via email. Now she was shaping federal AI policy, running a research lab focused on responsible technology development, and teaching the next generation of engineers that ethical constraints weren't obstacles to innovation. They were the foundation of sustainable innovation. I want to build something that outlasts us, she said finally. Not just policies or frameworks, but a culture where asking should we build this is as important as asking can we build this. Where engineers see themselves as responsible for the social impact of their work, not just its technical functionality. Carmen raised her glass. To building things that make the world better instead of just making rich people richer. To building things that treat human dignity as a feature, not a bug. They clinked glasses and Rhea felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The satisfaction of work that aligned with her values. Recognition that didn't require compromising her principle. A future where her expertise was valued specifically because she'd refused to abandon her ethics when abandoning them would have been profitable. Later that evening, she sat in her apartment, a place she could afford now that ethical AI consulting paid better than unethical AI development, and opened her laptop one final time. Her email contained the usual mix of speaking invitations, research collaboration requests, and policy consultation opportunities. But there was also a message that made her smile, an automated alert from the monitoring system she'd built to track AI ethics violations. The alert showed that no major violations had been detected in the past week across any of the AI systems she was auditing. Companies were actually implementing the safeguards they'd promised. Engineers were building systems that respected user privacy. The regulatory framework was working. It wasn't perfect. There were still companies trying to find loopholes, still executives who viewed privacy protection as a cost center, still engineers who prioritized technical elegance over social responsibility. But the conversation had changed. The standards had changed. The expectation that AI systems should serve users rather than exploit them was becoming institutionalized rather than aspirational. Rhea closed her laptop and walked to her window, looking out at a city full of people whose data was increasingly protected by the systems she'd helped design. Not because companies had suddenly discovered moral principles, but because the regulatory and competitive environment now rewarded ethical development and punished violations. Knox was facing federal criminal charges. Her old company was operating under federal oversight. Marcus was building a consulting firm focused on ethical AI auditing. Carmen's company was setting industry standards for responsible development. Students across the country were learning about AI ethics as a core requirement, not an optional elective. The change was systemic, institutional, irreversible. Not the dramatic satisfaction of personal revenge, but the quiet recognition that her work had mattered in ways that would outlast any individual career or company. She'd been fired for refusing to compromise her principles. Now those principles were becoming law. Real justice, Rhea reflected, wasn't about watching your enemies burn. It was about building a world where their behavior was no longer tolerated, where the next generation of engineers wouldn't have to choose between ethical development and career advancement, where technology actually served the people it claimed to help. She poured herself a final cup of tea and sat down to work on her keynote address for next week's AI Ethics Summit. The title was Building AI That Deserves Trust, and the audience would include engineers, policymakers, and executives from across the tech industry. People who needed to understand that the future of artificial intelligence wasn't about replacing human judgment. it was about amplifying human wisdom. Rhea started typing, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the same precision she'd used to code ethical constraints into Nico years earlier. But this time she was coding those constraints into something larger, the foundational assumptions of an entire industry. Outside her window, Los Angeles glittered with the lights of millions of people whose privacy was now protected by systems she'd helped design. Inside her apartment, she worked on ensuring that protection would last long after her own career was history. Balance, not vengeance. Principles, not profit. A future where technology served humanity instead of exploiting it. The code she was writing now wasn't in Python or JavaScript. It was in policy papers and regulatory frameworks, in academic curricula and industry standards, in the moral imagination of engineers who would build the AI systems of tomorrow. And unlike code that could be modified or deleted by corporate executives, this code was becoming part of the foundational architecture of how society thought about artificial intelligence: permanent, principled, irreversible, exactly the way it should be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.